I'm pleased to welcome Robert Speer, Acting Secretary of the Army, and General Mark Milley, Chief of Staff of the Army. This committee is grateful for both of you and your many years of distinguished service and your continued leadership of our Army. 16 years of war have tested the Army, perhaps more than any other service. But time and again, our soldiers have met the test and proved their commitment, courage, and determination. It's the duty of this committee and this Congress to do their utmost to provide them with the support they need and deserve. That starts by recognizing that our Army is still at war. At this moment, 186,000 soldiers are deployed in 140 locations around the globe. They're fighting terrorists and training our partners in Afghanistan, supporting the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, all the while reinforcing the defenses of our allies from the Korean DMZ to NATO's eastern flank. The burden imposed on our soldiers only grows as threats to our nation increase and sequestration remains the law of the land. Given current operational demands, restoring readiness must be the Army's first priority. But the sad reality is that the focus on readiness issues in recent years has made little to no difference. For yet another year, just over 1/3 of the Army's brigade combat teams are ready for deployment and decisive operations. Just 3 of the Army's 58 brigade combat teams are at the highest level of readiness, and the Army still does not plan to return to full spectrum readiness until 2021 at the earliest. The President's budget request is supposed to be focused on restoring readiness. The buildup, the administration says, will have to wait a couple of years. That ignores what Army leaders have testified to this committee, which is that inadequate end strength is forcing the Army to consume readiness as fast as it produces it. In other words, the Army will never truly restore readiness until it begins to grow. Yet the President has submitted a fiscal year 2018 budget request that calls for 0 additional soldiers. Meanwhile, the Army is woefully behind on modernization, and our soldiers are increasingly unprepared to confront the harsh realities of 21st century warfare. Analyses by the National Commission on the Future of the United States Army, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Army itself have pointed to glaring capability gaps in mobility, lethality, and survivability. These problems will only get worse as adversaries such as Russia continue to modernize their forces. Put simply, our Army lacks both the adequate capacity and the key capabilities to win decisively. We cannot move quickly enough to modernize our Army and give our soldiers the advanced capabilities they need to prevail against a determined peer adversary. Yet today, the Army has still not decided upon a comprehensive Army modernization plan for the future. Indeed, despite the great potential of advanced technologies, from active protective systems to reactive armor to lethal munitions, the Army does not have a major armored fighting vehicle under design for the first time in nearly a century. It's little wonder our current National Security Advisor, General McMaster, remarked a year ago that the Army is, and I quote, outranged and outgunned by many potential adversaries. The Army's modernization woes are undoubtedly connected to the service's disastrous acquisition record over the last 2 decades. Too many underperforming or canceled programs, too few real capabilities fielded, and far too much taxpayer money wasted. Tens of billions of dollars were squandered on programs like the Future Combat System, the Comanche attack helicopter, the Crusader howitzer, the Joint Tactical Radio System, and the Distributed Common Ground System Army. Most recently, the committee has learned of the failure of the Warfighter Information Network Tactical, or WIN-T. This program, I urge my colleagues, if they don't pay any attention to anything I say today, this program has cost the taxpayer over $6 billion and is yet to meet the requirements of our warfighters. $6 billion. But even with all that said, it's also true that the Army will never recover from this troubled acquisition history if it's paralyzed by fear of repeating it. This committee has acted in the last two defense authorization bills to empower the leaders of military services in the acquisition process. I urge our witnesses to use these new authorities to drive bold change. Building a modern Army that can win decisively in the harsh environs of 21st century warfare will require visionary leadership. You will have to learn the lessons of the past, make tough decisions, take and manage real risks, and hold yourselves and those under your command accountable for results. When you do so, you will always have an ally in this committee, because I believe our soldiers cannot afford the false choice between readiness and modernization. We can and must do better. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. The Army is the first service to testify before the full Senate Armed Services Committee on their FY18 budget request. I would like to join you in welcoming Acting Secretary Speer and General Milley. Today's hearing, we commend both of you gentlemen for your service to our country and for your steadfast leadership of the Army. In light of the many challenges facing the Army, from rebuilding readiness and modernization, it underscores how important it is that we confirm a permanent Secretary of the Army. The President's FY 2018 budget submission for the Department of the Army includes $166 billion in total funding, of which $137.1 billion is for base budget requirements and $28.9 billion is for overseas contingency operations. This represents a roughly $5.1 billion increase over the FY 17 request. As the committee considers the Army's funding request, we must always be mindful of our national security challenges. It is highly unlikely that the demand for Army forces will diminish in the near future. Currently, more than 180,000 soldiers, active, reserve, and guard, are serving in over 140 countries, and while we continue to field the most capable fighting force in the world, 16 years of sustained military operations focused almost exclusively on counterterrorism has taken a toll on the readiness of our soldiers. Today, less than 1/4 of our nation's Army is ready to perform their core wartime missions, and some critical combat enabler units are in far worse shape. In addition, the evolving threat facing our nation impacts readiness, as the Army needs to train to fight a near-peer competitor in a full-spectrum environment. Unfortunately, while additional funding is important, it is not the sole solution to restoring readiness levels. It will take both time to rebuild strategic depth and relief from high operational tempo. I applaud the Army for making readiness their #1 priority, and General Milley, I look forward to your thoughts on the Army's progress. While readiness is vital, we cannot neglect investments in the modernization of military platforms and equipment. The Army's fiscal year 2018 budget requests $27.8 billion for modernization efforts, which includes $18.4 billion for procurement and $9.4 billion for research, development, test, and evaluation activities. Is their current request. I'd like to know if our witnesses feel confident that the funding for modernization is adequate. A recent focus of this committee has been to improve DoD acquisition processes, as the Chairman mentioned, to help reduce costs and to deliver the best new technologies and systems to our operational forces more quickly. I hope we can hear more about Army successes in improving acquisition, what role the Chief is playing in those changes, and what, if anything, this committee can do to be supportive. In the area of personnel, the budget requests the same active duty end strength as enacted in the 2017 NDAA, while again seeking measures to slow the growth of personnel cost. The President's budget requests a pay raise of 2.1%, modernization of the military health care benefit, including increased cost-sharing fees, and further implementation of the blended retirement system, which will begin in 2018. I hope to hear from witnesses their views on the cumulative impact these changes will have on the Army and its ability to recruit and train the best for military service. I applaud the Army for its integration of women into all of its formations without restriction, including Combat and Special Operations Unit, an evolution that I believe will greatly enhance the Army's ability to fill the ranks with the very best. The Army will need to recruit from all corners to meet the higher end strengths, and it is imperative for the Army not lower standards. I understand there may be calls by some to increase the Army's active duty strength in 2018 above the President's budget request. I caution that there must be a plan in place to use these additional personnel and to pay for them. Training and readiness are important, even paramount, and maintaining and enhancing the fighting ability of the force we have must take precedence over recruiting a larger force that may not be ready. Finally, as I've stated previously, enforcing budget discipline through the Budget Control Act is ineffective and short-sighted. I believe the Senate, in a bipartisan fashion, should repeal the BCA and establish a more reasonable limit on discretionary spending in an equitable manner that meets our domestic and defense needs. But while sequestration is the law of the land, budget requests that exceed the spending caps are not useful because they allow the military to plan for funds that are likely not forthcoming, adding to the uncertainty DOD seeks to avoid. There are many urgent issues to discuss this morning. I thank our witnesses for appearing before the committee, and I look forward to their testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome, Secretary Speer.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, I speak to you on behalf of our soldiers, civilians, families about the current state of America's Army. Your Army continues to march towards increased readiness while gaining momentum on modernization. Over the past year, the Army has been rebuilding readiness to counter the threats to the United States and our allies. You have heard General Milley talk about readiness as our #1 priority, and I've witnessed firsthand the readiness needs as I visited soldiers across our Army over the past 4 months. I saw the strain a high demand for Army forces puts on our total Army, their families, our civilian workforce. Frequent deployments and aggressive training schedules needed to prepare units are taking their toll. The pace of operations is as high as it has been in the past 16 years. Units are as busy at home as they are when they're deployed. I have seen and heard these impacts watching training and learning from senior leaders, soldiers, families at town halls, like the one I recently attended at Fort Bragg. Soldiers told me what they're going through and the impacts of constant deployments and training. I met soldiers training at Fort Stewart, and a month later, I saw these same soldiers at the National Training Center just months after returning from Europe, adding additional stress to Army families. I thank Congress for the fiscal year 17 budget, a critical step easing the strains while rebuilding readiness. Just a few weeks ago, I was with both regular Army and National Guard soldiers working shoulder to shoulder with our NATO partners in Europe. These forces rely upon readiness investments you made to organize, train, and equip them and make this country safe, deterring Russian aggression and reassuring our allies in Europe. Your funding stopped the decline of Army manning levels. It ensured deploying units like the soldiers from Fort Drum I met in Europe now have the increased flying hours to fund readiness improvements. Fiscal year 17 funding enables us to modernize aircraft, armored vehicles, and air and missile defense systems. Your authorizations also increased investments in our ammunition stocks and upgraded infrastructure and production line capacities in the Army's organic industrial base. This is a good first step, ensuring we have the munitions we need and into the future. Our $137.2 billion fiscal year 18 budget request sustains 1,018,000 total Army. This Army will be capable of meeting global obligations while investing in capabilities for wartime operations and challenges. This budget builds on the fiscal year 17 by continuing readiness improvements. It begins a long-term effort to improve long-range fires, air missile defense, continues to replenish munition stocks, and provide advanced protective systems for combat vehicle and aviation. It begins to fill shortfalls in theater sustainment and transportation capabilities, and it will sustain increased Armored Brigade combat teams and combat aviation brigades, both in high demand across the globe. If we don't get the money we request, we will not be able to modernize our Army and thus continue to mortgage our future readiness. Above all, the Army needs sufficient, sustained, predictable funding to restore balance and reduce risk. The Budget Control Act and continuing resolutions cause uncertainty. They force us to make trades and prioritize readiness over other investments. Raise the defense caps. It is far more cost-effective for the Army to balance current operations and future modernization when we can rely upon predictable funding that extends beyond a single year's budget. We are the stewards of the funds you provide on behalf of our nation. We are committed to Secretary Mattis's emphasis to rebuild and reform our processes and resource efficiently and effectively. To this end, the Army will conduct a financial statement audit on 30 September of this year and will remain audit ready. The Chief and I are aggressively reforming acquisition processes. We must deliver capabilities to warfighter quicker and at lower cost. I want to provide every soldier, civilian, and family member the care and respect they deserve. The Army is making progress against stamping out sexual assault, sexual harassment, and retaliation, and other offensive behaviors. As a former Army officer, married to a former Army officer, and the father of 4, this is a personal priority. We demand respect among our soldiers and civilians and will not tolerate destructive behavior in our formation. In addition, our continuing Soldier 2020 initiative of standards-based assignments, regardless of gender, is working and solid success at Fort Benning, Georgia. Thank you once more on behalf of the men and women of our Army. Your funding for fiscal year 17 restored the balance to our Army. We are asking you to provide resources in fiscal year 18 request and provide budget predictability into the future. With your help, the Army will continue to build readiness and modernize to meet the challenge. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Milley.
Thanks, Chairman McCain and Ranking Member Reed and all the distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I just want to take a moment to publicly express to our great ally, the British people, the condolences of the entire United States Army in the horrific attack against the innocent in Manchester. This should also serve as a stark and brutal reminder to all of us that our efforts against ISIS and their fellow terrorists are righteous and just. ISIS must be destroyed, and ISIS will be destroyed. For the past 16 years, the United States Army has continuously provided trained and ready forces in Afghanistan and Iraq as we simultaneously executed a wide array of missions in support of the geographic commanders around the world, as the Chairman noted earlier, in Europe, Korea, Africa, South and Central America, with 180,000 troops in 140 countries. About 40 or 50% or so of the demand from the combatant commanders is met by Army forces, and about 70% of unexpected emergent demand is met by Army forces. The bottom line is the United States Army continues to meet all missions required of us, and we still remain the best ground combat force in the world. However, as the Chairman earlier pointed out, the United States is increasingly being challenged, and gaps in both capability and capacity have emerged. You, this Congress, recognize that, and your support in the FY17 budget stopped the downward trend in readiness and capacity for the Army. And the Army is making very, very slow and very steady progress, but slow progress in our core warfighting skills across the total force. And we still have much, much more work to do to achieve full spectrum readiness and modernization. And the most significant help we can get from Congress, frankly, is a steady, predictable funding line, raise the BCA top line, and stop using CRs from year to year. Adequate and predictable funding is absolutely vital to combat ISIS, fully recover our readiness, address capacity and capability shortfalls, and is a critical first step to set the conditions for improving future readiness that will be needed in an unforeseen contingency. If the BCA and the CRs continue to define our resourcing, then we risk reversing our readiness recovery that has just begun, and it will result in a hollow Army. And that will show up in the blood of our soldiers on some unknown future battlefield. While I recognize the Code Pink protesters behind me, and I recognize their right to protest, everyone should be mindful that the right to protest is purchased with a soldier's blood. Combat is unforgiving, and it's more unforgiving on armies that are not manned, trained, equipped, or well-led. Advances by our adversaries are real. It is not fake news. Their advances in capability, capacity, and their increasingly willingness to use that military instrument of power in foreign adventures. The cumulative effect of persistent and destructive budget instability is increasing risk not only for the Army, but for the nation. Readiness, capacity, and capability to deter, or if necessary, to fight and win wars is very, very expensive, and we know that. But the cost of preparation is always far less than the cost, the sacrifice, and the pain of regret. The current battlefield against terrorists is already very lethal, but a future battlefield against a near, peer, or regional threat will prove far more lethal. Our adversaries study us, and they are rapidly leveraging technology, improving their capabilities, and are clearly asserting themselves in many ways, both seen and unseen. Time, I am telling you, time is not our ally. Witness the almost weekly provocations by North Korea, to cite just one example. We request your support for this budget, which we recognize increases the defense caps imposed by the BCA. But we need this, and we need it now, before it's too late. Specifically, the Army requests congressional support for our readiness and modernization priorities. In readiness, we want to retain the end strength increases authorized in the FY17 bill to fill the force structure to combat levels of manning. We want to continue investment in high-quality home station and combat training center op-tempo and the operations and maintenance to support that. We want to increase our aviation and ground maneuver capacity, replenish critical ammunition stocks, and continue supporting our efforts to maintain aging equipment. In modernization, or future readiness by another term, we ask for your support for air and missile defense, long-range fires, preferred munitions, mobility and lethality improvements for our brigade combat teams, active protection systems for air and ground capabilities, assured mission command, electronic warfare, cyber, and vertical lift. We recognize that the American taxpayer entrusts us with a significant amount of money to meet those requirements, and we will be diligent stewards of our resources and enforce accountability to make effective use of every dollar. And Senator McCain, I commit to you that we will not make the mistakes of the past in the acquisition process. Your support for the FY18 budget will ensure our soldiers are ready for the missions of today as we prepare for the unforeseen conflicts of tomorrow. I thank you for the opportunity to testify and look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, General Milley, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, do you believe the return of the Budget Control Act caps for 2018 is the most critical and immediate threat that that the Department of Defense is facing?
Mr. Chairman, I absolutely do. The Budget Control Act caps for our defense puts us at tremendous risk. If it were returned, we would lose $15 billion of purchasing power, which would degrade readiness. It would degrade our modernization even further.
And OCO is a gimmick.
And the funding for OCO cannot be relied upon for the long run, and we need that predictable funding.
General Milley, you struck by you mentioned the words "hollow army." That I haven't. This committee has not heard that since General Scheimeyer came over and said it back in the 1970s. How far away are we from a hollow army?
I believe, Senator, that if we continue on the road and we execute the BCA or go back to BCA caps and fundings and continue with CRs, it will result in a hollow army. How far away? I think right now what you did last year was you stopped a downward trend. You halted it, stopped the bleeding, so to speak. We turned a corner, and we are, in fact, making slow but steady progress in readiness. If that stops, we will eventually, in not too distant future, have a hollow army and put soldiers at risk on a battlefield.
And the trend as you see it right now?
The trend is that for the Army's trend in terms of readiness, I think we have stopped it, stopped the downward trend, and I think we started to recover last year with the monies that you gave us.
But
we have a long way to go.
But the fact is that this budget may, at least as far as readiness is concerned, just stop the bleeding, right? It doesn't address the urgent need for modernization. Is that a correct statement? There is modernization, obviously, in the budget. We put about 26% or so into modernization. But that's relative because 8 years, 2008, we had, roughly speaking, 3 times that amount of money into modernization. And if you go back 15 to 20 years, it's significantly more. So your assessment is correct. Our modernization has been sacrificed for current readiness. Can I just, again, go back to this acquisition? Future Combat System, $20 billion. Comanche, $5.9 billion. Crusader, $2.2 billion. Helicopter, $500 million. Ground Combat Vehicle, $1 billion. Distributed Common Ground System Army, $3 billion. Joint Tactical Radio System, $11 billion. And of course, now we're looking at this WIN-T debacle. What, as you know, 2 years ago, we passed legislation that gave you a lot more control over acquisition. What's happened since then? And control and input, I guess, is a better description. And I thank you for that. And we've made actually quite a bit of reforms in the acquisition system already. Not 100% complete yet, but we have a key thing that we've done is reinserted
the commanders into the acquisition process. For many years, it was staff-centric. I am personally inserted into it in a big way, along with the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. We re-energized what was called an AROC system, which had gone fallow for a while, and that is meeting weekly, and it determines the requirements of the systems. We've also initiated the RCO, the Rapid Capabilities Office. The bottom line is what we're trying to do is through insertion of the chief and others in uniform into the acquisition system is to reduce the time and speed up the procurement and get the taxpayer the best bang for the buck, so to speak.
And yet it still seems to take years.
It does, and it's very frustrating.
You know, somebody told me the other day that the aircraft that I flew, the A4, they put out A4 Skyhawk, that it took 4 weeks. 4 weeks, and they were ready to let a contract. Now, we were just discussing a new replacement for the incredibly failed LCS, and they said, we may be ready for an RFP by 2020.
Right.
What's the difference, General? And if some of us feel frustrated, it's hard for us to continue to fight for more money when we see $6 billion wasted on one program.
Yeah.
So give me some comfort, either one of you.
Well, Chairman, I think you heard some of it already in terms of that, and we thank you for what you've allowed already to push it down. The role of Chief back into that and pushing it back down to the services, more rapid decisions. A lot of that $40+ billion you just read off are a disgrace. But at the same time, we're getting after, we can't hold the future mortgage notes, and so we do need to modernize. The list the Chief gave you is a good start. We are working on a regular basis to push those down, involving costing, doing strategic portfolio analysis that the Chief's heavily involved in. We've got to get costing and quicker decision-making processes in that and make informed, rapid decisions in fielding this equipment.
Is it of interest that 90% of defense spending is in the hands of 5 companies? Senator Reed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, Army readiness, the brigade combat teams, as I understand now, roughly 30%. Is that a fair judgment about the readiness status?
Roger, that's correct. The exact readiness, I'd be happy to brief you or your staffs from classified session.
Right,
but
understand.
as an order of magnitude,
Sure, we're in that ballpark. And
right, and the goal, of course, is 66%.
66%. And what are the 2 or 3 key steps that you have to take, you think, to get from what it is today to that 66%?
There's several of them, but the most significant right now, the drag, if you will, is manning. Many of these units are not at the full manning level, and that drags down their readiness in terms of the reporting system we have, but also in terms of going out to training and or deployment. So if a unit, we have a significant amount of non-deployables still. We've dropped that number by 2/3 over the last 5 years, but there's still a significant amount of non-deployables. So if we fill units at 95%, you have 10% non-deployables, it takes you 85%. You take away the day-to-day grind, you're down to 80% or less that goes out to training. That is not a good thing. You should at least be 90, 95% when you go out to training. You go to the Combat Training Center, NTC, JRTC. So manning is a critical drag on the system. We have made improvements because of the money you gave us in terms of spare parts and making the equipment better, so that's a good news story there. But the manning has continued to drag. So with the authorization in 17 to take us to 476, what we want to do is make the existing force structure whole. There are some minor force structure increases in this budget request, but we want to make the force structure that does exist complete, whole, and fully ready before we move on to the next step, which is expanding the Army.
And in that regard, I understand 10% of the non-deployable personnel are non-deployable for medical reasons.
About 85 to 90% actually are
medical.
The rest of them are legal and other reasons.
And how are you trying to get at that? Is there something in terms of enhanced training or lifestyle or anything else that seems to be a significant problem?
Yeah, the majority of those are orthopedic type injuries. Most are recoverable with some extended profiles, so they're non-deployable in the short term. Total Army, out of the 1 million+ troops, about 20,000 about 2% or so, are hard down. They'll never be able to deploy. And those we're working through the IDES system. And the number of days it takes to process them has come down from well over a year in the 370s, 390s range of days. We got it down by 100 days to 270. So we're trying to chip that away so that reduces the number of permanent non-deployables down, and the VA then picks up their care. But there's several things we have to do internal to the organization.
But one of the things I assume you have to do is improve recruitment and retention in order to get to your, just fill up the current existing force structure. Is that accurate?
Our recruitment and retention right now are at this point, are meeting the goals. Last year, we had 100% across the board. To date this year, we're about 80% or so for recruitment, and we're about 75% to date. Of course, the year's not finished yet on retention. With the increase in the end strength authorization of 476, we significantly increased the recruiting and retention missions. I think we'll be within 1% plus or minus of achieving that by 1 October.
In terms of modernization, there's a tendency to make incremental improvements in equipment. And as the chairman pointed out, when it takes so long to develop a new system, that incremental improvement is in many cases almost obsolete by the time it gets to the troops. If you're looking for a leap ahead, system, is there one out there that you think would make a huge difference that could?
It depends on the category. In the area of shoot, there are some technologies in laser, electromagnetic guns. There's some things being done with powders, et cetera, that can reduce the footprint of powder. So there are some significant enhancements in the S&T and R&D world that we're exploring aggressively, and some of those are already being employed by the Navy in quantities, but they're not sufficient yet for ground combat. In terms of move, there's a lot of things that we're looking at in terms of robotics and autonomous systems. Chairman McCain mentioned the tank. I couldn't agree more. That the M1A1 Abrams tank was commissioned when I was lieutenant in 1980. That would be the equivalent of someone coming in when I was commissioned training on the M4 Sherman from World War II. His comment about quoting H.R. McMaster's about outgunned and outranged is accurate. We need a significant 10x level improvement in our ground combat vehicle, in our tank in Bradley. Is there something on the horizon? We are going to continue with incremental improvements to those two systems in the near term, while we explore the possibility for 10x improvement. There are some bright lights out there. Look, for example, at what Tesla just did. They have cars now that were 100,000 or 40,000, and they just beat out GM and Ford, and they don't have an engine. They're running on a battery. There's some serious possibilities in there for application of military use, and we're looking at that. There are some exploratory studies being done in materials, significant material development that can provide the same protective power at a much significantly less weight. So there's things in the area of move. Communications, move, shoot, communicate, sort of binning. For communications, Chairman McCain mentioned WEN-T and the others. The communications architecture of the United States Army, and I would argue even the United States Department of Defense, is a critical capability and at the same time a critical vulnerability, as it is for most other nation states. And there's some significant, and I don't want to go into too much on it for classification purposes, but there are some significant changes and improvements that must be made in the short term on our ability to have assured communication, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had hearing after hearing after hearing, and we talk about the threat level that's there, and I think we all agree, but I want to talk about that. But on this acquisition thing, I was 8 years in the House on the House Armed Services Committee before coming over here 20 years ago. And with the business background, it drives you crazy to see these things happen. The FCS, we went through this thing, and I guess the figure on that the chairman just talked about was $20 billion. That was from 2001 to 2010. Now, and then along came the Crusader, and I was here during that time. That actually was terminated by Bush in his administration. So when you make the statement, General Milley, that you don't want to make the mistakes of the past, how can you do that unless we change and improve the acquisition system? You are complimentary of the chairman, and that we have made last year some changes where you have a greater impact on making those decisions. But still, they were made by the administration. In fact, in the case of the Crusader, one of the really outstanding guys on the House Armed Services Committee resigned. He quit because of the fact that you get that huge investment, then you turn around and abandon it. So I guess my question to you is what we did in starting to give you more latitude in helping with those decisions on acquisition and terminations, do we need to go further?
I believe, yes, we do, but I do appreciate the reforms that were made in the last cycle, and they have made a difference. And I can see that in several systems, small systems like the pistol, you saw that, up to larger systems that we're doing for like the ITEP engine for the UH-60 and several other programs that are out there, the PIM program for Paladin and others that are out there. So there is a difference being made. In terms of big ticket items like a brand new tank or a brand new helicopter, no, not yet. And part of that is because of limitations in current and existing technologies. So I do think there's been progress made, and I do think that the enhanced authorities that were given to the chiefs has made a difference, and I appreciate that.
Well, you mentioned the PIM program, which of course was taking an old system and upgrading it as opposed to a brand new system. Was that the right decision at that time?
I believe yes.
I think,
again, it goes back to technologies. I think we're on the, my assessment is we're on the cusp, we're within 10 years of a fundamental change in the character of warfare and the character of ground warfare.
Yeah, well, you also talked about, in response to the question, I think it was Senator McCain, about a hollow army. I chaired a committee of the vices just 3 weeks ago. And at that time, it was Wilson with the Air Force, and he had said, we're already there in the Air Force in terms of the hollow Air Force. So that's, you know, a few of us up here are old enough to remember the Carter administration and how we tried to recover from that. And I'm sure that we're going to try to keep from having that happen again. Now, before Senator Sullivan starts talking, because he's going to penetrate this a lot more than I will, because there isn't time. But when you look at all the threats that are out there, a lot of us come to the conclusion that it really North Korea is it, for two primary reasons. One, it's run by a mentally deranged guy that no one can predict. And secondly, they are rapidly getting to the point, as came out from the examination by Senator Sullivan yesterday or the day before, with that capability that it could, you know, it's not a matter, I think they said not a matter of if, but when. So why don't you just concentrate, if you would, just on North Korea for the remainder of my last 45 seconds here, on why you, if you agree with us in terms of that being the greatest threat.
Well, Senator, you know, we're in a current war against ISIS, and probably the greatest capability out there remains Russia. But clearly, North Korea is probably the most dangerous, close in terms of time threat, in my view, that the United States faces. And they are rapidly developing an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear weapon attached that can range the continental United States. And I don't think that we should allow that, and I don't think that's the policy of this nation. And I believe the President of the United States, when he says that if China doesn't solve it, the United States will. So I think that's the right approach, but I do think it's increasingly dangerous. There's no question the path they're on. I don't want to go into things that we do, but it is dangerous.
Well, I do believe in the hearings that we've had, both the civilians and the uniforms alike have talked about how great the threat is. And you guys, and I appreciate the fact that you're doing it, we don't have the credibility out on the stump to talk about this, and particularly when you have a media who doesn't believe you. But with the military talking about it, I think that's significant. So I do applaud you and the others for not veering away from the threat that's out there, and it's very real. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your distinguished service to our nation. I want to pursue the questioning on North Korea. You said close in terms of time to developing an intercontinental ballistic missile. How close?
I'd rather take that into a classified session center with all due respect. And there's a variety of analysis out there, and there are ranges. And I'd be happy to walk you through at least what I know from my perspective, and we can get some experts in to brief you as well if you'd like.
Wouldn't the American people be well served by more information about this threat so that they do appreciate what the facts are?
I think that's probably an accurate statement, sure.
And in terms of the troops that the United States Army has at potential risk from conventional artillery, how many would you estimate are in harm's way?
Well, the United States has, publicly 28,500 troops of all branches. In Korea, roughly speaking, about 20,000 of those are Army. And North Korean conventional tube and rocket artillery has extensive range, can range all Seoul, it can range most of the military compounds. So our troops are at risk in Korea.
In your testimony, you mentioned the importance of vertical lift in the Army's modernization priorities. And as you know better than any of us, the Black Hawk has served the United States Army for some 35 years. It continues to be the aviation backbone of the Army. Could you tell us what the state of negotiations are for the next procurement of Black Hawks?
Well, we've got, I want to say 48 that we've put into this budget. We're also working on the ITEP engine, which is equally as important as the airframe in order to enhance the capability of the Black Hawk to fly at high altitude, around 6,000 feet or so, and at high temperatures, around 95 degrees. So both the procurement of additional helicopters and the modernization of the engine, the improved engine, are significant for the lift capability of the Army.
Wasn't the expectation from the future years defense program projected for FY18 that there would be 60, not 48 helicopters in the budget?
I would have to go back and check that number, Senator.
Do you believe that more than 48 are necessary?
Yes. I mean, in order to flesh out and replace existing aircraft, sure. And when we get past 18, we have plans to do that.
A number of your colleagues, heads of services, have said that the greatest threat, or perhaps one of the greatest threats, if not the greatest threat to our nation, is cyber. Mm-hmm. And I've noted in your testimony that relatively little analysis has been included about cyber.
Well, cyber is a very serious threat, and others have testified openly that the opening shots of a large-scale conflict are likely to begin with cyber, and various people have testified to that, and you see that in writings, and I'd probably concur with that. Cyber is a very serious capability out there. What we, the Army, are doing is fielding 61 what we call cyber protection teams, and 41 of those are in the regular Army, and 21, 20 are in the 41 and 21, 62 for the National Guard and the United States Army Reserve. Of the ones in the regular Army, they should all reach full operating capability by the end of 18.
The Chairman and I have noted, and I apologize for interrupting you, but
Sure.
I'm limited in terms of time, that there really is no cyber strategy. Without a cyber strategy, there can be no cyber policy. I think I'm quoting almost directly what the Chairman said yesterday. And that has been a failing, to be very blunt, under a number of administrations. Would you agree that we need a cyber strategy to determine, for example, what is an act of cyber war? How do we respond to a cyber attack in the cyber domain.
Right. I mean, fair question, and I think that needs to be debated. It's an answer, or question that needs to be asked and answered. It's not asked and answered right now. Well, what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace? And I'm certainly not in a position to answer that. But in terms of capability, the Army does have a cyber strategy for capabilities, capability development, and our emphasis is on defense for the Army. The national part does offense, Army does, the services doing defense. And what's important for us is to protect our network, protect our ability in the electromagnetic spectrum from everything from degraded operations or complete shutdown all the way to spoofing and mimicking and so on and so forth. We have set up the first, as far as I know in the world, live cyber range at the National Training Center. So all of our tactical units now are cycling through the training center where they're being exposed to an enemy, a free-thinking OPFOR out at the training center that executes high-end cyber operations against our own units. And our soldiers are learning to come to grips with that. And it's a very interesting thing to go watch, to see how our forces operate with the WIN-T or any of the other communication systems we have, where they are under constant attack from the enemy, and they are getting degraded, and we have to relearn how to operate with limited, degraded communications in our connectivity to higher headquarters and adjacent units. So we do have a strategy for capability development, but the national strategy you're talking about, I think that's fair.
I would like to also add to that when it comes also to the individuals and the people we're assessing and training. We've got of the 41 active component cyber teams, 33 of them are already mission capable, fully mission capable. Another 8 are initial capabilities. The Cyber Center of Excellence, as well as private industry, are working out on a regular basis to incorporate additional capabilities and understanding, and we're assessing individuals in training and development into the reserve components as well.
Thank you, Secretary Speer. Thank you, General. Thank you.
Secretary Speer and General Milley, let me start off by asking about the Lakota, the Army's primary training helicopter, and how the situation currently affects the industrial base. The last production contract was awarded in 2015. There's an ongoing legal dispute which is expected to remain in the courts until late this year. Absent new orders soon, the manufacturing plant may be forced to lay off workers. The FY17 omnibus appropriated $198 million to purchase 28 Lakotas, and there is clear directive in the language the Army must obligate the funds to buy Lakotas, although this has not happened. I know this is an important program because the Army requested $100 million in FY18 for 13 additional Lakotas. But how are we coming on the directive to obligate the funds to buy the 28 Lakotas from the FY17 omnibus bill, and what are our prospects for moving along on the 2015 contract?
Senator, I think you hit it initially. We need the Lakotas in terms of the training base and get them down there in terms of Rucker to go. The 2017 funding is held up in that same protest. So we need to buy against that contract to be able to deliver in a timely basis, and that current contract is under protest, and we hope that will be resolved next quarter of this year. And then we'll be able to put the additional funds on contract and request the additional 28.
So that would be July, August, or September?
That's what we're hoping so, later this summer, yes.
Okay, and General, you do agree that this is a very important program?
I'll be candid, Senator. It's important, it has utility, but a Lakota aircraft won't survive a nanosecond in combat. It is good for administrative use. It is good for running soldiers around at home station, and it's very good for training. However,
it is a training.
It's a training platform, so I don't want to overstate its importance. What we need to invest our aviation dollars into primarily are combat utility aircraft and attack aircraft. The Lakota has a purpose. It has a place in the system. That's why we put the money in there. But I don't want to overstate or elevate its importance within the pantheon of aviation.
Okay. Well, let me ask, then let me shift to one other thing in the time I have remaining. And let me, and I want to ask about MRAPs. In 2013, the Army decided to divest a large portion of MRAPs. Things are different now than they were in 2013. We're ramping back up in Afghanistan. ISIS is more of a threat than it was then. Is it time to take a fresh look at the MRAP program?
I think in terms of the MRAPs, we did retain a set of MRAPs for this kind of operation contingency, and I believe we have sufficient MRAPs of different varieties and variants to support. Now, I can go back and look and come back to you in terms of the latest review on MRAPs, but the current threat in terms of decisive action, training, and obligation is where the biggest risk is for the longer term. We do, I believe, have sufficient variants of MRAPs to do operations against ISIS or counterterrorism.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk a bit about procurement to either or both. What lessons has the Army learned from the procurement problems that we've had in the past with the Comanche, the Crusader, Future Combat System? Are there lessons learned that we can apply to future acquisitions?
Well, we could spend all day on the lessons learned on those, and I think we got after a lot of them. First of all, we took the decision maker.
I only have 5 minutes.
I got it, Senator. It's part of the decision. If you look at a lot of the laundry list, was we removed the decision maker from where the functional decision of the requirement was. We've built in layers and layers of decision-making processes that took too long. Cost was not an informed cost. We made decisions at the end of the requirements after we spent a lot of money, when we could have made discoveries much earlier on. So that's part of what the chief's getting at, and I'm getting at in terms of this. We've got to get cost early in front. We've got a decision allowed to fail up front. We've got to be able to prototype in those things, and we've got to put the warfighter back into the decision process down where the execution of that program goes.
Was one of the problems expansion of requirements and complexity of requirements?
I think the complexity of the requirements expanded and always been there technology-wise, but again, the requirement was best understood by the individuals who were building the requirement and have to provide feedback on how well they're doing with the requirement on the delivery of the capability.
Well, General Milley, on this point, we had a very interesting hearing in the Airland Subcommittee a couple of weeks ago on a new rifle for the Army to replace the M4. One of the things we learned was that the current M4 caliber ammunition will not penetrate the newly developed body armor of our adversaries, which is, to me, a disaster in waiting. Your thoughts on a new weapon, and how do we do the procurement in a timely and cost-effective way and avoid some of these problems that we've had in the past? First, do you think this is an important area of attention? And second, can we pull it off in a reasonable amount of time at a reasonable cost?
I think yes and yes. I think it is critically important. 70% of American casualties are ground forces, typically infantry, special forces type units or units performing infantry missions. And the small arm and the other equipment, to include body armor, SAPI plates, and so on, is critical. And we ought to be providing the very, very best for our soldiers that our nation can provide. The 5.56 round, we recognize that there is a type of body armor out there that it doesn't penetrate. We also have that body armor ourselves. And that adversarial states are actually selling that stuff on the internet for about $250. So yes, there's a need and there's an operational need, and we think we can do it relatively quickly. The key on any of these things is not so much the rifle, it's the bullet. It's the ballistics of the bullet, and down at Fort Benning, we've done some experiment and developmental work. We think we have a solution. We know we have developed a bullet that can penetrate these new plates.
Does this bullet require a new rifle?
It might, but probably not. It could. It can be chambered, and the bullet can be chambered in various calibers. I don't want to get into the technicals of ballistics, but it can be modified to 5.56, 7.62, or...
Is there a possibility of an off-the-shelf, an existing rifle that could be an upgrade to the M4?
Yes. There's several options out there.
And that would be an option.
There's absolutely options out
I
there.
commend that option to you.
Sure.
The FY budget request holds the Army end strength at 476,000, 343,000 National Guard, 199 Reserve. Are those numbers sufficient in your professional judgment to meet the challenges that we have in terms of readiness and assuming a higher level of training and readiness? And secondly, how long does it take if we decide we need 10,000 more or 20,000 more end strength? How long does it take to get from decision to troops in the field?
The first question, the first part of that question, is it enough, so to speak? That depends on what we're asked to do. Secretary Mattis is leading a very rigorous and detailed strategic review of the defense planning guidance and the national military strategy. That review will be done probably sometime in the fall. When that review is done, that will give us our baseline of how well or how big and what capabilities we will need across the board as a military, not just the Army. In the meantime, we do already have a national military strategy and a defense planning guidance, and as I testified last year, I thought that the capacity, the size of the force, and the capability of the modernization of the weapon systems did not meet that. And 476 improves it, but no, it still does not meet the worst-case requirements that are outlined in the National Military Strategy and the Defense Planning Guidance.
Second question, how long does it take to build up?
Well, to build units, to put a brigade together from scratch, I would say it would take about 3 years to get them at a reasonable level of training. But soldiers coming through basic training in AIT, individual replacements, they're falling in on existing force structure and existing units, and that takes considerably less time. And then one of the things we're introducing in this bill is security force assistance brigades, which are essentially chains of command of an infantry chain of command, for example, an infantry brigade. They'll be used for deployment overseas to do advise and assist missions, like what you see in Iraq and Afghanistan today. That'll free up the brigades that are there. We'll put those back together again, and then it will shorten the timeline for rapid expansion. We plan on introducing 5 of those. We've got 2 in this particular budget for the request. So it varies by type unit, but on average, I would say between 1 and 3 years, 3 years being the outside, to put together enough of the force and the collective training, assuming you had the people and the money to support that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, thank you for your appearance this morning. I want to return to an issue that Senator McCain foot-stomped in his opening statement, WIN-T, the Warfighter Information Network Tactical, the way the soldiers communicate on the battlefield. In 2003, the Army planned for future combat systems that would, among other things, network together soldiers and vehicles. That program was canceled in 2009 at the cost of approximately $18 billion. WIN-T was part of the Future Combat Systems program. After Future Combat System was canceled, it was another attempt by the Army to conduct secure battlefield communications and networking. General Milley, I have seen credible reports that WIN-T has ineffective line-of-sight communications, is not survivable, is too fragile to survive in a contested environment, and has an electromagnetic signature so loud that it practically would call for enemy artillery on the top of its users' heads. Have you seen similar reports?
Yes, and what we've done is, with the authorities the chairman and the committee and the Congress gave us a couple of years ago, is I and the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, along with a small group of people, are driving a rigorous, thorough, and painful review of the entire communication electromagnetic capabilities of the U.S. Army, of which WIN-T is one part of, because we have the same concerns. Frankly, my concern is these systems may or may not work in the conditions of combat that I envision in the future with this changing character of warfare, because of what you just cited: line of sight, electromagnetic spectrum, the inability to operate on the move, the inability to operate in large, dense, complex urban areas or complex terrain. And there's a whole series of other things. And it is fragile, and it is vulnerable. So we're taking a very, very, very deep, hard, and wide look. We've probably got about 6 weeks or so, because what I want to do is make sure I can get it into any changes to this cycle, the markups that we can, if we need to. There's piece parts of it that work very well. There's others that not so good. and we're taking a hard look. And as you may or may not be aware, I've received a letter from the House with 176 signatures on it, and a letter from the Senate with several signatures on it asking me to accelerate that program. I'm not going to accelerate it until I'm convinced it will work in combat against the enemies of our country that may be coming in the future. So that's kind of where we stand right now. But I owe you and this committee and others a rigorous review within about 4 to 6 weeks or so.
Thank you, General. I'm aware of those letters. My first priority is delivering functional systems to our warfighters on the front lines. My second priority is good value for our taxpayers. You know, the political implications of these contracts in members' districts are a very low priority compared to those for me, as I'm sure they are for you as well. We've spent about $6 billion so far on WIN-T, haven't we?
That's correct.
If the program's not working, it doesn't seem, as you say, like we should be accelerating more money into that program until we can get it to work, or we can find a replacement. Is that a fair assessment?
Correct, and that's where we're at. And I'm trying to figure out exactly what parts of it could be accelerated or brought online, others that we need to not. Continue to put good money after bad, and make sure that the system as a whole, a holistic review of the system, is something that is going to be effective in what we think will be a dynamic combined arms maneuver fight on a very, very highly contested and lethal battlefield.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the effort you've put into not just these kind of communications programs we've discussed before, the distributed common ground system and its problems. You were discussing earlier some of the issues with small arms that the Army has had. I want to encourage you to continue to use those authorities. Most of these problems arose long before you took office, but I want to encourage you to continue to try to address them and resolve them at the speed that our warfighters need, not the speed of bureaucrats in Washington. I want to turn briefly to the European Reassurance Initiative. I know you've taken it very seriously. I'm encouraged by the heel-to-toe deployments we've seen of armored BCTs as part of the initiative. Do you think a permanent armored BCT presence would be preferable, though, to a perpetual state of deployment?
My recommendation, my preference, for a lot of reasons, is a rotational schedule, heel-to-toe rotational schedule, which has the effect of a permanent unit in there in terms of battlefield effect, but it doesn't come with the cost and overhead of a permanently stationed force. I know Chairman Thornberry in the House has asked us to take a look and cost that out. Others are interested in permanent stationing. At this point, my recommendation is continued rotational forces, vice permanent station. What that gets you is flexibility when you're over there, where you can move from one country to another, because these forces won't be pinned down to a single installation. You won't have to resurrect all the commissaries, the PXs in the schools, et cetera. Families won't be put into a potential conflict zone, and you'll get battle-focused training on an increased unit cohesion for the unit training. I think the way to go is rotational for the brigade combat team, but I'm willing to take a good look at it.
Thank you.
Senator, could I add to that? Because just when I visited the ERI operations currently in Europe, I would add that the commander, the brigade commander, said the same thing in terms of units, the best training he's had. The spread, how well he was spread across the theater of operations. He could not get, you know, if he were stationed in one location, he'd have to go across and spread his organization anyhow on a recurring basis. The combat aviation brigade may be a different situation. There was challenges there, but I think we're working through this. Tremendous lessons learned coming out of that kind of rotation for readiness.
Well, thank you, and I've heard similar things in my trips to the Baltics. It's an important reminder for the American people that we're not just deploying troops there for the benefit of those nations, but for the very good training that our troops receive there as well. Thank you, gentlemen.
General, the WIN-T program has been in existence for over a decade. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, Senator.
So should we expect a decision on WIN-T on the part of the administration at some point after we've spent $6 billion?
Yes, and
Don't the taxpayers of America deserve something better than that?
absolutely, and that's why we began 4 months ago, the Vice and I and others,
So
Secretary,
it took
to
only
rigorously review this.
9.5 years before we undertake a extensive review. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Speer, yesterday the Army's budget was released, and again there were
no military construction projects to support the testing and evaluation missions at White Sands Missile Range. That actually makes 18 years in a row now, and certainly White Sands is not alone. So I am concerned that the Army is not currently prioritizing testing infrastructure, and nor are the other services. I know that others share my concern that the Pentagon is not doing enough to upgrade our testing capabilities, which would ultimately allow us to keep our competitive edge over our adversaries. So, Secretary, do you believe that the Department is effectively managing and allocating resources for military construction projects at our test ranges?
I think broadly, it's part of the overall situation with military construction. We still continue to take a little bit of risk in the military construction. What we do find, and I believe, and I go back and confirm this, within this, we put additional restoration modernization to upgrade facilities within the budget, which included a test range. We doubled that amount this year for restoration modernization. We have a $10.8 billion backlog in such restoration and modernization requirements.
I would just urge you to look really closely at test ranges generally. I think you're taking a lot more risk there than you are in other places, and it's just absolutely critical in terms of developing the technologies that are going to pay off for our warfighters in the future. In a related issue, as you're aware, White Sands is managed by the Army, but it's a test range that the Air Force uses as well, the Navy uses, obviously the Army uses. Does it make sense for the Army to be the only service responsible for funding major military construction projects on what is a tri-service testing range?
Well, Senator, much like other installations where we're the executive agent or we are the owner of it, that's the way we prioritize. We work together with our sister services to identify requirements across the joint community, and I think we'll continue to do so. I think it's been the past, predictable funding and level of funding to get at the stability, to take care of things on a recurring basis, and we took risk over time on those things. And you have my commitment. I'll go back and review those things, because I would agree, as part of what we talked about earlier in the acquisition process, earlier testing and the ability to look at things earlier in the testing cycle is very important.
I appreciate your commitment on that, and I want to just highlight one military construction project at White Sands in particular, because it sort of tells the story of what is being passed up over the course of the last 2 decades. The Network Communications Center for the range was built in 1962. It actually caught fire a couple of years ago, but it has not been a priority in recent years. And I think in the era of big data and technology, a modern information facility is pretty critical for transmitting the vast amounts of data that pass through White Sands at this point, for the data that's being generated during those tests. So that's just one particular example. General Milley, I really appreciated your comments earlier about some of the things that are on the horizon in terms of emerging technologies and some of the things that are really right in front of us. And in April, Admiral Harris testified before this committee and stated several times that we have no defense against North Korean rockets, North Korean artillery, North Korean mortar rounds. From a defensive standpoint, does the Army have an effective indirect fire protection capability at this time?
Against what type of indirect fire? Rockets, missiles?
Rockets, artillery, mortar rounds.
We have capabilities that can shoot down incoming missiles.
Right.
That's THAAD, Patriot.
Yeah.
In terms of bullets, tube artillery, or close-range rockets, we're experimenting right now with hypervelocity capabilities. We think we can field those pretty shortly. I think you've seen some of that both in the media and have been briefed on it by Will Roper at DOD. That's an Army program he's working on, and we're funding that. And that will be important if we can make that happen, and that'll increase significantly our capability to shoot down incoming rounds.
In addition to kinetics, which tend to be incredibly expensive on a per-round basis, I was very pleased to see that the Army budgeted for next-generation weapon systems by funding the 50-kilowatt high-energy laser on a Stryker vehicle. And I think that shows enormous potential. Not just potential, I think we're at a place now where we've shown that we can shoot down mortars with realistically funded lasers and do it on a very low cost per shot capability. So I would urge you to continue to focus on that.
But I don't want to mislead you. These programs are not ready for prime time yet in the fielded force. So you're talking several years there of consistent, predictable funding to make those real, developed, and distributed to the force. Several years. If an event happens prior to then, there's significant risk to those enemy weapon systems that you talked about.
I think we may differ on just how far out that timeline is.
Situation today is that they literally have the capability to set Seoul on fire. Is that correct?
I think that North Korean capability that's arrayed north of the DMZ is very significant, and it would do unbelievable damage. It would be a tragedy of immense proportions on a city of Seoul with 27 million people and a population density of 4 times that of New York City. It would be huge. And their tube and rocket artillery alone can pump in 250,000 rounds a day into that city. It would be huge. It would be enormous.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and General Milley. Mr. Secretary, good to see you, General. And Mr. Secretary, appreciated the opportunity to visit yesterday. I wanted to follow up on Senator Inhofe's questions with regard to North Korea. So it has been stated a number of times in this committee by military experts that it is no longer a matter of if, but when North Korea is going to have an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile that can range the entire United States of America. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'd say it depends on what we...
If, but when?
Well, I'd say it depends on what we do, Senator.
Well, let me actually get to that. And by the way, I actually agree with Senator Blumenthal's point about allowing the American people to have a sense of when that may or may not be approaching. Of course, there's estimates, both classified and unclassified, but I think getting it out there will prepare the U.S. public for a really challenging national security issue that I don't think a lot of people are paying attention to. Yesterday in testimony, or 2 days ago in testimony, Director Coates stated it was the policy of the United States to prevent that capability from ever being realized. Is that your understanding of the policy, General?
Absolutely. That's my understanding of the current United States government's policy is to prevent North Korea from fielding an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear weapon to strike the continental United States. I believe
so that's a red line in some ways that we...
I wouldn't use that word. I don't use any words like that, but I believe that's the U.S. policy is to prevent that capability from being fielded by North Korea.
So if we had to take action against North Korea to prevent that from happening, would your U.S. Army forces and the entire weight and power of the U.S. military dominate the battlefield to make sure we achieve that goal? If we had to?
I mean, I believe yes, but I don't want to go much beyond that. Absolutely yes, us and the ROK Army would dominate the battlefield. North Korea would not succeed, and North Korea would lose. The cost would be huge, but North Korea would lose.
Let me actually 2 questions. Do you need anything more? What do you need from this committee or the Congress to ensure that we would dominate and prevail if that day, God forbid, ever came?
I think the priorities that we laid out in our opening statements and are in the budget, that's what I think we need. And most importantly, we need predictable funding over time.
Let me ask, General, you and I both talked about the book T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War a number of times, the whole issue of no more Task Force Smiths. Could you describe what a war with North Korea would look like, and would it be similar to what we've seen over the last 15 years in Iraq and Afghanistan?
No, it would not look anything like the war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
What would it look like?
Well, it depends on our actions, action, reaction, counteraction. There's several different possibilities, and I don't want to go into any great detail on any of them, but I can assure
what would it likely look like?
If there was a full-blown war in the Korean Peninsula, just as Secretary of Defense Mattis said the other day, it would be tragic on an unbelievable scale, and the levels of violence would be immense, and it would be the likes of which the world hasn't seen since the Second World War. It would be huge, and there'd be huge amounts of casualties.
On both sides?
On both sides, yes. It would be horrific. But I don't want to go into the details of what that would look like. And that would get into the realm of speculation or contingency plans, and that would be inappropriate in an open hearing.
You emphasized in a recent interview that our soldiers need to, through their training, need to be able to be miserable again to, I don't think you used the term, but it was mentioned in an article in the On the Rocks magazine, embrace the suck, as they say in the Marine Corps and the Army. Are we conducting that kind of rigorous training right now, do you believe, that would prepare for that kind of T.R. Fehrenbach, like this kind of war?
Yes.
Where we don't have logistics bases, we have miserable conditions, people are suffering. Are we conducting that kind of training to prepare our
Yes,
forces?
we've shifted back to combined arms maneuver on a dynamic battlefield against a high-end near-peer threat. And we have shifted away from fixed sites, constant flows of logistics, in our training, constant flows of logistics, et cetera. And we have gone through 16 years of war where we conditioned as an institution COPs and FOBs, and some of those had pretty significant quality of life capabilities. Others were very austere. There were many COPs up in Afghanistan or Iraq that were not very well outfitted at all. But my point in saying what I said about being miserable is that we have got to train ourselves and condition ourselves for a type of war in which you are unlikely to have this steady stream of continued logistics beyond perhaps water, ammunition, food, and some medical. But all these other things, chew huts, hot showers every day, sleeping in a bed, and so on and so forth, those will probably not be available if we fight against a highly competitive, dynamic, regional, or near-peer power. The land battle will be unbelievably violent, and units will have to move every hour or two just to survive. And logistics and lines of communications will be cut off, and units are going to have to be able to be independent of thought and mind. Your communications are going to be degraded. It is going to be significant, and we need to train to that, and that's exactly how we've shifted our training in the last couple of years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. I want to quickly ask about the importance of our non-military agencies' programs to the Army's mission. I've asked every combatant commander the following question, and to a person, they've almost all given the same answer. General Milley, would a significant reduction in funding to the State Department and other non-defense security agencies and programs make the Army's job of defending America easier or harder?
Well, Senator, I'm not going to comment on funding levels for other agencies.
Not asking you to.
I would just say that we in the Army, or we in the military, the armies don't go to wars. Nations go to wars. And we need and require in combat operations, and most importantly, to secure the gains of combat operations, secure the peace, so to speak, we need the State Department, USAID, FBI, Commerce, CIA, all these other agencies, because the military doesn't do things alone. We do it as part of an interagency and joint team and an allied team.
Thank you very much, General. I agree. The administration is seeking nearly a 30% reduction in the Department of State and USAID. Our military is critically important to our security, but we can't forget that non-military programs are also critical enablers of our military so that you can do your job and so America can do its job. I want to ask you another question, and that is about the WIN-T system. I understand there's already been some conversation about it. I know that there were significant problems with the first version, delays, but that those seem to be solved in the 2.0 version of this, and more to the point, that there is no obvious substitute. This is the only communications program that is available for the Army that works on the move. And so the question I have relates to this. General, you've said several times that on the future battlefield, it is imperative that soldiers keep moving. And you told the Association of U.S. Army that at their annual meeting last year that in the Army of the future, If you stay in one place longer than 2 or 3 hours, you will be dead. But as I understand it, under the current timeline, it's going to take the Army about 20 years to fully field the upgraded WIN-T system. And in 20 years, that upgraded system is likely to be obsolete. So given your comments about the importance of constant mobility, the fact that this is our communications under those, in a circumstance where we've got to have a lot of mobility, why is the Army taking so long to field this piece of equipment?
Well, you missed some previous comments, but right now, it's under a rigorous review that's being led by the senior leadership of the Army, the Secretary and the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. And I have concerns about not only WIN-T, but WIN-T is a subset of a larger network of systems. And I have concerns about its interoperability, line of sight to operate in complex terrain, its survivability and vulnerability to enemy systems, its ability to operate on the move. The bottom line is I have some serious, hard questions that have not yet been satisfactorily answered as to whether this is going to work. And I believe I'll come to that resolution within the next 6 weeks or so. And like I told Senator McCain, I'll be happy to, and I intend to report out to you on the status of that. So I am reluctant to accelerate anything unless I know this thing's going to work. On the second part of it is why is it taking so long? I mean, that's one of my concerns, is a system that's not going to get fielded. It's already been in development for 10 years. A lot of this stuff's already out of date. So the entire acquisition approach, especially in information technologies, we need to review that. It's one thing to build rolled homogeneous steel and guns and tanks and vehicle systems, but the technological speed of advance in the commercial sector on information technologies is far more rapid than anything that the government's acquisition system is capable of handling. So by the time we even come up with requirements and start doing prototyping and experiments and tests, these systems are already out of date. So there's a fundamental issue in the IT world. It's not just WIN-T, it's much broader than that, that it causes me to be skeptical from an acquisition procurement standpoint on WIN-T in particular, but other systems involved in it as well.
Well, I appreciate that, General, and I appreciate our responsibility to try to make the procurement system work better and work better for you, particularly in an area where there's a lot of innovation and change over time. I also assume, and I'm glad you're looking at this, that if the WIN-T system is working and we don't have another substitute, that we will make a decision and then try to move quickly on it one way or the other.
Right.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I appreciated Senator King's comments talking about small arms and the need for modernization and the fact that our 5.56 doesn't penetrate Russian body armor. I think that was a really important point that was brought out at my subcommittee hearing, and one of the reasons I think many of us will agree the need to prioritize small arms modernization in this year's NDAA. So, General Milley, once the Army does settle on a caliber, then would you rather have something that could be specifically built for our infantry forces and the Army at large, or would you accept something that could be purchased off the shelf?
I don't know that the two of those are mutually exclusive. There are systems out there today on the shelf that, with some very minor modifications, could be adapted to munitions that we're developing at Fort Benning that could be used to penetrate these sappy plates that our adversaries are developing. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily an either-or proposition on that one. I think there's weapons out there that we can get in the right caliber that can enhance the capability of the infantry soldier.
That's good, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think there could be some potential savings if we are looking at systems that could be modified, taken off the shelf, and used for our soldiers. I think that would be something that would be very beneficial to our forces. Retired General Scales testified at that subcommittee hearing, and he spoke about a weapon that could fill the role of both the machine gun and the rifle, a light machine gun and the basic rifle. So is the need for for the machine gun, would that be a higher priority than that of just a basic rifle? Or would they be at the same level of priority?
No, I mean, they're both very important, and they complement each other. I think what he's talking about is what the Marines are adopting is the M27. We're taking a hard look at that and probably going to go in that direction as well, but we haven't made a final decision on it. But, you know, infantry squads, infantry platoons, they got to have an automatic weapon for suppression. They've got to have the individual weapon as well. So you need both. It's not one or the other. You have to have both in order to be effective in ground combat.
Absolutely. Thank you, General, very much. Today, I'm introducing a bill with Senator Gillibrand that would require each branch of the military to educate service members on sexual assault prevention before they actually leave for boot camp. And if they choose to do the delayed entry program, which many of our young men and women do. The bill also states that those classes should be conducted in person and cover the proper use of social media. So we would actually have a live human being standing in front of those young men and women presenting that class rather than taking a computer course or just reviewing PowerPoint slides on their own. Sexual assault really is a societal problem, and we really do need to have continuous education on that, and we do that once we have members in the service. But we really do need to start as soon as possible. And what more can we do to curb military sexual assault in the Army?
Well, Senator, I think we are doing a lot, and we're continuing to adapt more. One, we're working with private-public partnerships with folks like within the national colleges. I think you may have heard already from Bob Caslin at West Point.
Absolutely.
Doing the same thing through the TRADOC schools. I saw something I was very excited about. I know you talk about personal people in terms of teaching, but I saw some very immersive type leader training using synthetic training environments, providing very real individuals who provide input through those systems of their life story and how to combat, how they respond and what happened to them. So there's a lot of things across, but either through individual training incorporating into the schoolhouses that we continually try to educate leaders on how to handle, to educate individuals that they need to come forth and provide that they've been assaulted or harassed. But anything that we find is useful and it improves the situation is definitely welcome to look at.
Yeah, very good. I'm glad to hear that. I just think there is more that we can do. The point is to prevent the problem before it ever happens. And so that's the intent of this bill, is to get the message out before they even enter into the service. And I've often thought that it should be one of their peers rather than like the old lady of the battalion standing in front of them and lecturing them. Just having that human face-to-face contact, I think, will be very important in moving this forward. So thank you, gentlemen, very much for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you for your excellent testimony here today. It's been fascinating. Earlier this month, Major General William Hicks, the Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policy in the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff, indicated that the Army is, and I'll quote him, thickening our armor posture going forward, and plans to create a 16th Armored Brigade team through conversion, and this is on top of plans to create a 15th Armored Battalion next year. So with that, I'd be interested to better understand the Army's plan for additional armored brigades and to equip those brigades with some more modern versions of both the Abrams tank and the Bradley fighting vehicles.
In short, over the last 15, 16 years of combat, we re-wickered the Army and created a highly dense infantry force, and we reduced our armor capabilities, our air defense, our artillery, et cetera. As we come out of a war against terrorists and insurgents, or we shift gears a little bit and start looking at near-peer regional competitors, it's clear to us that we need to rebalance the force structure with additional armor capabilities. So that's the logic behind it. Our armored brigade combat teams right now are at a less than a 1-to-1, or correction, less than a 1-to-2 deployment dwell ratio. So we need additional armor capabilities. So we made a decision to go ahead and convert an infantry brigade combat team at Fort Stewart and put that back into tanks and make that an armored brigade combat team. We intend to do the same thing in the coming year. As far as equipping that, we've had to do a pretty sophisticated set of logistics moves that AMC and General Gus Perner are doing that with Forces Command and General Abrams. But I think we'll be successful in doing that, making that transition and equipping those armored forces. But that's a critical capability that we need to do to rebalance the force.
Well, having said that, General, and I agree that that's a critical capability, particularly with the changing nature of some of the threats, particularly in Europe. And I appreciated your earlier comments about having a forward presence in Europe to help our allies as part of the European Reassurance Initiative. And I know both of you mentioned, Secretary Speer, you mentioned this as well in your written testimony about the growth of Army pre-position stocks in Europe, which include both the division headquarters, 2 armored brigade combat teams, and a field artillery brigade. So my question is, how are we doing when it comes to pre-positioning some of this vital heavy equipment in Europe? And is there anything else that you may need from Congress?
You know, I got the matter of fact the chance to go see that, and they're doing extremely well. Matter of fact, there's a emergency deployment readiness exercise where we use the enhanced systems sets out of the pre-positioned stock to train and show the deployment capabilities of those. They are loading, bringing in between the 17 and 18 funding that we've received and requesting, fills those position stocks with that you just laid out. In addition to that, NATO is adding at Powitz a NATO-funded location to add that part of the pre-position stock in Poland. We are not fully up in terms of, I think if I recall right, 4 of the 9 pre-position stocks are fully 90% capable. But some of the funding, we need predictable long-term funding to make sure we can continue to fill those pre-position stocks. And then in addition to that, make sure that we upgrade and get the most current systems being fielded, traded out.
General, do we need additional armor pre-positioned in Europe?
We are planning to do that, and that's the update that Secretary Speer just gave, was the equipment sets that are over there, armor equipment sets. As far as in addition to a rotational brigade, so you'll end up with 1 Stryker, 1 airborne, 1 armored brigade, and then there's a division headquarters over there along with the enablers of artillery and aviation and so on. Is there a requirement for more? That's really a geopolitical question, is what does it take to deter further aggression from the Russians? How much American ground forces are required in combination with air and naval force in order to deter any more aggression, say into the Baltics or anywhere else beyond the Ukraine? And those are under study and analysis. We think that's an adequate amount of force right this minute, but conditions can change. So I would have to update you later if conditions change. We think our plan right now for ERI is adequate to the need.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service to our country. When we first envisioned the cyber force nearly 7 years ago, the threat was far different than what it is today. As the role of cyber and military operations has matured, and as we look towards the need to develop a cyber deterrent strategy, I'm curious as to whether or not we should be evaluating whether the size or composition of the force is sufficient to meet the growing demand. Is there a process underway to determine if 62 Army cyber teams is sufficient? And if not, should there be one?
There is a process. It's led by Lieutenant General Nakasone. He's the commander of our cyber. And as you recall, Army Cyber is a subordinate component headquarters or organization to U.S. Cybercom, led by Admiral Rogers. There's a continuous evaluation in terms of need. I expect, frankly, in the coming years, it to grow. We just made it a branch a short while ago. We've established an Army Cyber Center of Excellence down at Fort Gordon. We've brought in a couple of thousand young soldiers that are joined that branch. It's one of the more popular branches coming out of the Military Academy and ROTC to seek commission in. I frankly think we're in the very early stages of the growth, significant growth, of a cyber branch within the United States Army and more broadly across all of the services within DoD. So I think I fully expect to grow in the coming years in the cyber realm.
Let me, Section 1647 of the FY16 NDAA required the cyber vulnerability assessment of all major weapon systems by the end of 2019. How is the Army supporting these assessments, and what, if anything, can you share in what I recognize as being an unclassified form about the work that's being completed?
I'd actually like not to do that in open hearing, other than to say we are actively participating in the vulnerability assessment, and to say that Army systems, like every other system in both civil society and the military, most of them have cyber vulnerabilities, and we're working very, very, very hard and as fast as humanly possible to put in protective measures, both organizational, training, doctrine, but also equipment, software, and hardware. It is an area of big focus, and I'd like to stop there in terms of the specifics.
Let me just ask, you've had a number of questions and comments today about WIN-T. Is that system, WIN-T, considered a major weapon system with regard to the determination of cyber vulnerability? So,
right.
So the WIN-T is also undergoing the same
absolutely.
cyber vulnerability tests as the other major weapon systems?
Yes.
Thank you. Let me ask also, Section 1650 of the FY17 NDAA required the cyber vulnerability assessment of Department of Defense critical infrastructure by the end of 2020. How is the Army supporting those assessments, and what, if anything, can you share in this, once again, unclassified form about the work?
I'll let the Secretary answer that, but I would give you the same answer.
Yeah, I would give you the same answer, but I think you've seen some anecdotal stuff, for instance, that where both the Pentagon is using Hack the Pentagon. You've seen us doing Hack the Army, and some cyber assessments to see how well the software and some of the things that we have the capabilities and the infrastructure to protect. But I think that the rest is left unsaid.
Thank you. General Milley, you indicated earlier in your conversations today that, and I'm going to paraphrase somewhat, within 10 years, there will be a fundamental change in the way that we conduct warfare. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit, please, for us?
Sure. I separate it into two. One is the nature of war, which I think is immutable and it's unlikely to change, and that has to do with war as a form of politics by violent means. It's fog and friction and fear and confusion and so on and so forth. Those sort of human things that are out there, that's probably not going to change. It hadn't changed in 10,000 years, probably not going to change in the future. But the character of war does change on occasion. And one of the drivers, not the only driver, is technology. Other drivers are social change, et cetera. So one of the things that led, for example, to Napoleon's success was a political change in France, a revolution, that allowed him to have a levée en masse, or allowed him to have an army of the people, so to speak, and he was fighting against other armies of monarchs whose soldiers were either mercenaries or draftees that didn't have a choice. But the French people of Napoleon's army thought they were fighting for a country and a cause, and they bought into the state. So that was an example of a political change that changed the character, and that enabled Napoleon to conquer Europe. Other technological changes are things like the rifle or the barbed wire or the introduction of the airplane, tracked vehicles, mechanization, the radio, and they were very significant in between World War I and World War II. Today, what I perceive happening is the confluence of societal changes that are rapidly happening. We're moving beyond 6 billion people in the world. We're getting to 8 billion people in the world, and roughly speaking, about 90% of them are going to be living in highly dense, complex urban areas. And if war is about politics and politics about people, war is an armed conflict, especially on the ground part of it. They're going to be fought in urban areas, highly complex, dense urban areas. That's a significant fundamental societal change to change how the American Army fights, where we fight, what the doctrine is, how we train the leaders, things like the communication systems and so on and so forth. We're going to have to adapt to that change, and that's coming within, for sure, 10 years. Other technological things like the introduction of lasers, rail guns, robotics, autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, they are fast approaching very, very quickly. And they will be, I believe, significant introduction into both air, maritime, space, cyber, and ground warfare. If you combine all of those things together, and there's many, many more, I think you end up with a fundamental change in the character of war. And what will be important is that country which connects those dots and applies those new technologies and those societal changes and adapts the best, those countries will prevail. Those countries that don't, they'll fail. They'll lose a war. And there's nothing more expensive than that. So that's when I said time is not on our side, that's part of what I meant. We have got to urgently move out because our adversaries are moving out. Russia and China are moving out. And North Korea, we see it every week. They're moving towards the development of nuclear weapons. The United States of America needs to step up our game when it comes to these changes because we're facing a fundamental change. And we need to end up on the other end of that change in a better position than we are right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for being here and for your service. General Milley, back in February, and first of all, I'm embarrassed, and I want to apologize that we're sitting here having to have this type of conversation. We're sitting here at a time when the U.S. Army is the smallest it's been since World War II, and the disinvestment, particularly in the last 8 years, threatens the security of our country. And General Mattis said it best that the national debt's the greatest threat to our national security, and here we see why. I want to talk about readiness first. I have one question quickly after that. General Allen, just February, before a subcommittee on readiness, told us that 1/3 of our BCTs, 1/4 of our combat aviation brigades, and half of our division headquarters, only half, were deemed ready at that point. He also went on to say that only three of our, I think it's 58 BCTs in total, including Guard and Reserves, could be called upon to fight tonight. How does this budget proposal allow you to address that? And by the end of 18, if you were to get the amounts in this request, how many of our BCTs would be ready to fight, and how would you assess the readiness that we just described here?
Our readiness objective for the regular Army is 66% of the formations are at the highest level of combat readiness, and our objective for the reserve component, both National Guard and U.S. Army Reserve, is in the 60% of their enabling capabilities. Right now, that comment about a third, that's still relatively true. I'd rather give you a detailed, it has changed since General Allen has testified, and it's gotten a little bit better, but as I briefed earlier, it's a slow progress, not the level that I would like to see.
Sir,
but with this budget, with the completion of 17 budget, we still have part of that year to go, and the enactment of the 18 budget, I think we will see significant improvement because readiness is cumulative. And I think based on our current projections, assuming we hold constant things like op-tempo, and we get steady, predictable funding, then I think you'll see significant improvement in readiness by the end of 18 for sure. It won't necessarily be at the objective level, but it will be a significant improvement over what it is today.
How much would you need to get to objective level?
Steady, predictable funding for several years in a row, and a growth in the size of the force. We chose in this particular budget to flatline the end strength growth. If more money became available, I certainly would like to see that.
If you were to get a CR at any point in that 4 or 5 year period you're talking about that would tie your hands to redivert or to divert money from one area to another to address this readiness, how would that impact your ability to do what you're talking about doing?
CRs hurt. I'll let Secretary Speer, he's a finance guy, he knows more about how they hurt than I do, but I can tell you they hurt.
Yeah, you know, one thing's about the CR, especially the longer term they go, but any CR, they have a cumulative effect, and that's part of what we're coming out of from 13, 14, 15 on. Not only in terms of the ability for a commander to know and sustain predictability for training and what they're going to do, they are by nature conservative. So when they see the funding may run out, they react differently. They can be risk averse to that. But also you start making bad purchasing decisions, and those types of things go on. The cost of doing it.
Make shorter term decisions is what you're saying.
Correct.
Less optimal decisions that you would make if you had a steady runway of dependable
Well, they're more
funding.
expensive.
More expensive too.
Right.
I mean, they hold things to the very end, and you have a whole bunch of purchases at the very end of the year that you don't get the best bargain for.
It's a crazy way to do it. This CR thing is you know, just one man's opinion, I suppose, but it's a crazy way to do it.
Sir, I come from a different world, too. I come from the business world. I've never seen this done anywhere else in the world. It's absolutely absurd that we're going to do that and tie your hands about allowing you to move money from one department to another to even adapt to reduce levels of spending. And our procurement program, that was the other thing you mentioned just now. One of the competitive issues that I believe, and you just said it, is that will make winners and losers in the future is how quickly we can adapt technology to the battlefield. It sounds to me like with what we've been doing compared to what China's doing, particularly with the rise of their investment, they're spending about $826 billion a year in comparable terms on their military today. That compares to our $600 billion, just to put that in perspective. In addition, they can bring things to market so much quicker. Would you elaborate on that just a little bit and how China is outpacing us in terms of bringing new technologies to the battlefield?
Your assessment is accurate. They have made significant advances. You know, we're in the 38th year, I guess, since Deng Xiaoping and the 79 reforms. So they have made a massive economic improvement in their society for 37 consecutive years. It's the largest economic shift in global power in 5 centuries. And when that happens, inevitably throughout history, significant military capability follows. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing a significant development of Chinese military capability, and it's relatively rapid. They are not at 100% of our levels yet in some areas, but in other areas they've developed capabilities that are quite challenging. The specific capabilities, I'd prefer not to talk about them in open session, but it's a significant capability that they're developing.
Thank you both.
Senator Reed. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick follow-up question with respect to small arms. To what extent, if we adopted a new round, would it impact the interoperability of our relationship with NATO countries, the rounds that they have? And related to that is, what would it cost us to refurbish the worldwide stockpile, which exists now of 5.56 and 7.62?
And those are all part of the analysis that we're doing down at Benning. But just to put your mind at ease a little bit, what we've developed is a 7.62 bullet. So it's not like something that's not in the inventory anywhere. Right. We've developed a pretty effective round down at Fort Benning. We think that we can get that into production here in a year or two and get that fielded out to the force. It is 7.62, not 5.56. But not everybody necessarily needs this idea that the entire Army, everybody needs the same thing all the time, is not necessarily true. There are some units, some infantry units that are much more highly likely to rapidly deploy than others and conduct close quarters combat that we would probably want to field them with a weapon, a better grade weapon that can penetrate this body armor that we're talking about.
And but would this round be interoperable with NATO allies? And
I probably should owe you a specific answer. I think yes. So it's a 7.62 round, so I think the answer is yes. But let me get you a specific ballistics answer.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. Welcome. Thank you for your service to our nation, particularly at this time of great challenges abroad and rising perils. I want to thank you both for your work, particularly on the fiscal year 18 defense budget and your commitment to rebuilding our military capability to keep this nation safe, to restore our readiness, and make sure we're in a position to defeat our enemies and to defend the homeland. I want to talk about several aspects of the budget. The first concerns Fort Hood and other Texas bases, which is that we visited the barracks and other facilities at Fort Hood and other Texas bases, and the bachelor enlisted quarters are currently at unacceptable habitable levels. And now I understand that MILCON spending has been limited due to the operational challenges causing the services to make difficult budget decisions. But can you share with this committee your commitment to providing the necessary sustainment and restoration and modernization of these facilities to keep them functioning at a habitable level.
So, Senator, I would agree with you. The past non-predictable funding, the problems of lower funding we had has created some strain on what generates some readiness from the institutional base of the installations. We have, and thank you so much, the fiscal year 17 budget add additional resources to sustaining those installations to include Fort Hood. We've asked for, inside the FY18 budget, double the restoration and modernization previously. We got over $1 billion more than we had in fiscal year 17. So we will get after both not only Fort Hood, but other installations in terms of improving modernization readiness of the facilities. Milcon has not been plussed up as much. We're still taking some risk, and we'll have to look at that in terms of the total infrastructure of the installations in the future.
Thank you. Let me turn, General Milley, to a different topic, which is that prepositioned stocks in South Korea are planning to move back to the continental United States to equip a new armored brigade combat team. Could you expand on the reasons why the prepositioned stock has to be relocated from a forward deploy location, supporting rotational units to outfit an ABCT that will be stationed in the U.S.?
Thanks, Senator. The two things. One is that equipment's over there pre-positioned for a force to arrive for training or otherwise. The intent is that the armored units that deploy there will deploy with their equipment. As I mentioned earlier to one of the senators, for the last 15, 16 years, our force, we restructured ourselves to fight insurgency and counterterrorist fight. And we went with infantry heavy, which is appropriate for that type of fight. As we look at the world ahead, we need to rebalance a little bit, so we need to increase our armor brigade combat team capability. So we want to create a 15th, convert one infantry to a armor, to create a 15th, and then create a 16th after that. That equipment, the keys that you're talking about, will be necessary to create that 16th armored brigade. Absent that, we won't be able to do it, given the money that we have and the production of and the vehicle inventory that we have. So that's the logic behind it. And we think it is an element of risk, but we think it's an acceptable level of risk, because that particular unit would be the one going anyway.
Let me turn to a different question, which is that the President's budget keeps regular Army BCTs at 31 without any increases across the active duty National Guard or Reserve Forces. Does this budget contain any provisions that would aid in the future reactivations of new BCTs?
Yes. First, the 31st, it was 30, and this budget request keeps 31. That one is the Airborne Brigade up in Alaska. So that's where you get your 31st one. There are modest increases in force structure built into this budget. One of the ones that relates to your question is the Security Force Assistance Brigades. They are the chains of command. Think of them as a chain of command from Staff Sergeant on up of an infantry brigade. They will train together, they will work together, and they will deploy as advisors to places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places where we think we need advisory help for indigenous forces. They won't have soldiers in them, though. They won't have the privates and the sergeants and the corporals, et cetera. So if we need to expand rapidly, they do form the basis, the nucleus, the leadership piece of a brigade combat team that we could bring soldiers through basic training in AIT and fold them underneath that chain of command, and you could very quickly have an additional brigade much faster than building one from scratch. We plan on building 5 of those, 4 in the regular Army, 1 in the Guard, and that would be an expansion there. The other part of that is what we're trying to do with this budget is fill the holes of the existing force structure. And then we're going to want to come back to you in the 19 budget with what we think is the optimal force structure for the national military strategy and the defense planning guidance that General Mattis or Secretary Mattis is currently leading us through a very rigorous review of that, which we expect the results will be finished with it probably in the fall. Once we're done with that, we come back in 19 with, here's how we think we make ourselves right-sized for the challenges we think we face. This budget is designed, the last budget stopped the bleeding. This budget is to steady the ship and start the increase, slight as it is, but start the increase in readiness and modernization and modest increases in capacity.
Thank you,
I
General.
hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony, for your service. On behalf of Chairman McCain, let me call the hearing adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen.